The knock came at precisely midnight, sharp and deliberate against the thick wooden door. Gideon Nash set down his coffee cup and listened. The storm outside howled with the fury of a wounded animal. But underneath that chaos, he heard something else. Breathing. Multiple sets of lungs drawing air in perfect synchronization. He moved to the window and peered through a gap in the shutters. 5 silhouettes stood motionless on his porch, rain streaming off their dark clothing like mourning veils. The lightning illuminated them in brief, stark flashes. Young faces, too thin, too pale, but their eyes burned with an intensity that made him step back from the glass. "We know you can see us," the tallest one called out, her voice cutting through the storm with unsettling clarity. "We've been walking for 3 days to find you." Gideon's hand instinctively moved to the rifle mounted above his fireplace. In 15 years of living alone in these mountains, no one had found his cabin. He had chosen this place specifically because it was forgotten, a dot on no map, invisible to the world below. Yet here they stood, 5 girls who shouldn't exist, shouldn't know his name, shouldn't be alive in this weather. "Mr. Nash," the voice continued, and ice formed in his veins. "We need to talk about our father." The words hit him like a physical blow. He gripped the window frame, his knuckles white against the weathered wood. There was only one reason someone would come here speaking of fathers and family. Only one secret buried deep enough to require this kind of pilgrimage. Through the glass, he watched the oldest girl reach into her coat and withdraw something that glinted in the lightning. A medallion. Even from this distance, even through the storm, he recognized the tarnished silver disc with its distinctive etching. His throat went dry. He had seen that medallion before. He had held it in his hands, warm with another man's blood, on the day he killed their father. The knock came again, more insistent now. "We're not leaving until you open this door," the girl said, "and we're not the only ones looking for you anymore." Gideon pressed his back against the wall, his mind racing. They couldn't know. It was impossible. He had been so careful, so thorough. But as he stared at those 5 figures waiting in the storm, he realized his past had finally caught up with him. And judging by the way the youngest girl kept glancing over her shoulder into the darkness beyond his porch, they weren't the only ones who had found him tonight. Gideon forced himself to breathe. His hands trembled as he reached for the door latch, then stopped. 15 years of careful isolation had taught him that opening doors led to complications, and complications led to consequences he wasn't prepared to face. "Your name is Ruby," he called through the thick wood, his voice hoarse. "Ruby Callahan. And those are your sisters behind you." A pause. Then, "So you do remember us." The medallion clinked against something metallic in her hand. Gideon closed his eyes, transported back to that blood-soaked afternoon when Thomas Callahan had pressed that same piece of silver into his palm, begging him to find his daughters if anything ever happened to him. The irony was bitter as medicine. "I remember your father," Gideon said. "Good man. Didn't deserve what happened to him. Liar." The word cut through the storm like a blade. "You killed him." The accusation hung in the air between them, heavier than the rain hammering his roof. Gideon pressed his forehead against the door, feeling the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. "He was stealing from us," Ruby continued, her voice gaining strength, "taking our land, our water rights, everything. And when he wouldn't stop, you put a bullet in his chest and left him to die in the dirt. That's not how it happened." The words escaped before he could stop them. "Then open this door and tell us how it really happened." Gideon looked through the window again. The youngest girl, Mercy, was shivering violently despite the older sisters trying to shield her from the rain. Her lips were blue, her small body racked with tremors that spoke of hours exposed to this weather. Behind them, he caught glimpses of movement in the tree line, dark shapes that moved too deliberately to be wildlife. His conscience warred with his survival instincts. These girls would freeze to death if he left them out there, but letting them in meant confronting a truth he had buried along with their father. A new sound reached his ears through the storm. Horses, multiple riders approaching from the east, their hoofbeats muffled but distinct. Ruby heard it too. Her head snapped toward the sound, and for the first time, fear crept into her voice. "They found us faster than we thought," she whispered to her sisters. "We need to get inside. Now." "Who found you?" Gideon demanded. "The same men who killed our father," Ruby said, and her words shattered every assumption he had made about that day 15 years ago. "The same men who've been hunting us ever since. They know we have proof of what really happened, and they'll kill anyone who helps us." The hoofbeats grew louder. Gideon counted at least 6 horses, maybe more. Professional riders moving with military precision through terrain that would challenge even experienced locals. "Please," Ruby's voice cracked, and for the first time she sounded like the frightened teenager she was. "We just need somewhere to hide until morning. Then we'll be gone, and you'll never see us again." Gideon's hand hovered over the latch. Outside, the riders were close enough now that he could hear their voices calling out coordinates, surrounding his cabin with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed hunt. He had spent 15 years running from the truth about Thomas Callahan's death. Now that truth stood on his doorstep, and the men who had created it were closing in fast. The latch clicked open, and 5 pairs of desperate eyes met his through the doorframe. Gideon stepped aside as Ruby shepherded her sisters into his cabin, their wet boots leaving dark prints on his clean wooden floor. The youngest, Mercy, collapsed immediately by his fireplace, her small body shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. "Bar the door," Ruby ordered, and Gideon found himself obeying the 17-year-old as if she were a seasoned commander. The heavy wooden beam slid into place just as the first rider's voice echoed from somewhere beyond his front yard. "Nash, we know they're in there." Gideon froze. They knew his name. After 15 years of invisibility, these men had not only found his cabin but identified him specifically. His throat tightened as the implications sank in. "How many are out there?" Clara Bell whispered, the 14-year-old moving to peer through a crack in the shutters. 6, Gideon said. "Maybe 7. They're spreading out to surround us." Ruby pulled something from her coat, a leather journal wrapped in oiled cloth. Even in the dim firelight, Gideon could see it was filled with meticulous handwriting and detailed sketches. "This is why they've been hunting us," she said, holding up the book. "Our father documented everything, every illegal land grab, every forged deed, every murder they committed to steal territory from settlers. He was building a case to present to the territorial government." Gideon stared at the journal, pieces of a 15-year-old puzzle suddenly clicking into place. Thomas wasn't stealing land. He was investigating who was. "The Meridian Group," Sadie said, the 12-year-old's voice hard with hatred. 7 men who call themselves legitimate businessmen but operate like bandits. They killed our father when he got too close to exposing them. And they've been tracking us ever since," Violet added quietly, the 10-year-old helping wrap Mercy in Gideon's spare blanket. "We've been running for 3 years, hiding in different towns, staying ahead of them." A rifle shot cracked through the night, splintering wood from his front door. The message was clear. Surrender, or they would take the cabin by force. "Gideon Nash," a voice boomed from outside, authority evident in every syllable. "I'm Colonel Wade Jennings. You have something that belongs to us. Send out the girls and nobody gets hurt." Gideon's blood turned to ice. Wade Jennings. He knew that name from wanted posters that had circulated years ago, before the man had apparently cleaned up his image and assumed a military title. Jennings was the kind of killer who could make murder look like patriotic duty. Ruby gripped his arm. "You know him." "I know of him," Gideon said grimly. "He's not the type to leave witnesses." Another shot, this one taking out his window. Glass scattered across the floor as cold air rushed in. "They're not going to let any of us live," Clara Bell said, stating the obvious truth that hung over them all. Gideon looked at the 5 sisters huddled in his cabin, these children who had spent 3 years running from men who killed for profit. He thought about Thomas Callahan, dying with evidence that could have stopped these monsters, and about his own 15 years of cowardice disguised as solitude. "There's a root cellar beneath the kitchen floorboards," he said, moving toward his rifle rack. "Hidden entrance under the loose board by the stove. You can crawl through the tunnel and come out near the creek, about 200 yards downstream." "What about you?" Ruby asked. Gideon loaded his rifle with practiced efficiency, his hands steady for the first time since the girls had arrived. "I'm going to buy you time to get away." "That's suicide," Clara Bell protested. "Maybe," Gideon said, checking his ammunition, "but your father died trying to expose these men. The least I can do is make sure his daughters live to finish what he started." Outside, the sound of breaking glass told him they were out of time. Wade Jennings and his men were coming through his windows. The first man through the window never knew what hit him. Gideon's rifle spoke once, and the intruder dropped like a stone, his weapon clattering across the floor. The sisters were already moving toward the kitchen, Ruby clutching the leather journal as if her life depended on it. Which, Gideon realized, it probably did. "Get down," he shouted, dropping behind his overturned table as answering gunfire erupted from outside. Bullets punched through his walls, sending splinters flying like deadly confetti. Colonel Jennings's voice cut through the chaos. "Burn them out. I want that journal, and I want those girls dead." The smell of coal oil reached Gideon's nostrils, followed by the orange glow of flames licking at his windows. They weren't just trying to kill them. They were destroying evidence of the attack itself. "The tunnel's blocked," Clarabelle called from the kitchen, panic edging her voice. "There's debris blocking the entrance," Gideon cursed under his breath. The root cellar had been his only plan, his single advantage in this impossible situation. Without it, they were trapped in a burning box with professional killers closing in from all sides. A memory surfaced suddenly, sharp and clear. Thomas Callahan, bleeding in the dirt, pressing that medallion into Gideon's hand with his last breath. "My daughters," he had whispered. "Promise me you'll protect them if they ever come to you." Gideon had made that promise 15 years ago, and then spent the next decade and a half convincing himself it would never matter. "There's another way out," he said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. "The back wall has a loose board. You can squeeze through one at a time, but you'll come out right into their line of sight." "Then we need a distraction," Ruby said, her young face grim with determination that reminded him painfully of her father. Smoke was filling the cabin now, making his eyes water and his lungs burn. Outside, he could hear Jennings's men coordinating their positions, professional and efficient in their approach to murder. "I'll give you a distraction," Gideon said, checking his remaining ammunition. 6 shots left. Against 6 armed men, it would have to be enough. "What are you planning?" Sadie asked, coughing as the smoke thickened. "I'm going out the front door," Gideon said simply. "When they focus on me, you run for the tree line. Stay together, keep moving north, and don't stop until you reach the town of Cedar Ridge." "That's 30 miles, Violet protested. "Your father walked 40 miles in 2 days to bring me evidence about these men," Gideon said, his voice heavy with a confession he had carried for too long. "Thomas didn't die because he was stealing land. He died because he trusted me with information about the Meridian Group, and I was too much of a coward to act on it." Ruby stared at him, pieces of truth finally falling into place. "You were supposed to help him expose them." "I was supposed to take his evidence to the territorial governor," Gideon admitted, shame burning hotter than the smoke. "Instead, I ran. I built this cabin and hid from the world because I was afraid of what they'd do to me." The fire was spreading faster now, flames crawling across his ceiling like living things. Through the smoke, he could see Jennings' silhouette framed in the broken window, rifle raised and ready. "Why didn't you tell us?" Ruby asked, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "Because some failures are too big to forgive," Gideon said, rising to his feet. "But maybe it's not too late to make them right." He kicked open the front door and stepped into the storm, his rifle blazing as 6 sets of eyes turned toward the sudden appearance of their primary target. Behind him, he heard the soft scrape of wood as the sisters began their desperate escape through the back wall. The gunfight that followed would be brief, brutal, and entirely one-sided, but it would buy them the seconds they needed to disappear into the darkness, carrying their father's evidence toward a justice that was 15 years overdue. If this story is touching you in any way, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with someone who loves a good Western tale, and subscribe to the Western Redemption channel. Every single day at exactly 1 p.m., a brand new story drops, packed with emotion, justice, and redemption. So turn on the notification bell and don't miss the next chapter, because out here in the West, no one waits around. The gunfire stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the sound of rain and crackling flames. Ruby pressed her back against the wet bark of a pine tree. Her sisters clustered around her in the darkness beyond Gideon's burning cabin. Through the smoke and chaos, she had heard 3 distinct rifle reports from different positions. Then silence. "Is he?" Mercy whispered, but Ruby pressed a finger to her lips. They waited, hearts pounding as Colonel Jennings' voice carried through the night air. "Check the body. Make sure he's dead." Heavy footsteps approached the front porch. Ruby closed her eyes, gripping her father's journal so tightly her knuckles went white. Gideon Nash had just died for them, this stranger who had carried 15 years of guilt for failing their father. "He's still breathing," one of Jennings' men called out. "Took 2 bullets to the chest, but he's alive." Ruby's breath caught. Alive. Somehow, impossibly, Gideon was still alive. "Good," Jennings said, his voice carrying the cold satisfaction of a man who enjoyed his work. "Tie him up." We're taking him back to town for questioning. I want to know if he made copies of any documents, if he contacted anyone else. What about the girls? Another voice asked. They're on foot in a storm, carrying a child, Jennings replied dismissively. We'll track them down at first light. They won't get far. Clarabelle tugged at Ruby's sleeve and pointed through the trees. In the distance, barely visible through the rain, she could see the shapes of horses tethered near the cabin. 6 horses, but only 5 men remained standing after Gideon's desperate fight. One of them is wounded, Sadie observed quietly, watching as the men struggled to load their unconscious prisoner. Look how that one's favoring his left arm. Ruby counted heads and made a quick calculation. Jennings, plus 4 able-bodied men, plus 1 wounded, against 5 girls with no weapons and no experience in combat. The odds were impossible, but her father's voice echoed in her memory. Sometimes the impossible is the only choice you have left. They're going to take him back to town, she whispered to her sisters. To the same place where they'll eventually bring us when they catch us. Then we don't go to Cedar Ridge, Clarabelle said, understanding immediately. We follow them. That's insane, Violet protested. They have guns, horses, and we're Thomas Callahan's daughters, Ruby interrupted firmly. And we have something they want more than anything else in the world. She held up the leather journal, its pages containing enough evidence to destroy the Meridian group entirely. For 3 years they had run from these men, always reactive, always afraid. But Gideon's sacrifice had given them something new, an opportunity. They think we're helpless children running blindly through the forest, she continued. They don't know we've been studying their methods for 3 years. They don't know we've learned to track, to hide, to survive in conditions that would kill most adults. Mercy looked up at her oldest sister with wide, frightened eyes. What are you saying? I'm saying we stop running, Ruby said, her voice carrying the same steely determination that had made their father a threat to men like Jennings. We've spent 3 years being hunted. Now we become the hunters. Through the trees, they watched as Jennings's men loaded the unconscious Gideon onto a horse and began their journey back toward civilization. The colonel himself rode point, confident in his victory, unaware that 5 shadows were already moving through the forest behind him. They'll reach town by dawn, Clarabelle observed, her mind already working through logistics. That gives us maybe 6 hours to get into position. Position for what? Sadie asked. Ruby smiled grimly, and for a moment she looked exactly like her father had in his final photograph. Determined, fearless, and absolutely certain of his purpose. To finish what our father started, she said, and to make sure Gideon Nash's sacrifice wasn't in vain. The storm was beginning to weaken, but the real tempest was just beginning. Behind them, Gideon's cabin burned like a beacon in the darkness, while ahead of them, 5 girls prepared to wage war against the men who had destroyed their family. The hunted were about to become the hunters, and Colonel Wade Jennings had no idea what was coming for him. Dawn broke gray and cold over the town of Millbrook, revealing 5 exhausted girls crouched behind the abandoned blacksmith shop at the edge of the settlement. Ruby wiped rain from her eyes and studied the building across the street where Jennings's men had taken their prisoner. The old jail had been converted into a makeshift headquarters for the Meridian group, its barred windows and thick stone walls making it nearly impregnable. Nearly, but not completely. 2 guards at the front, Clarabelle reported, her voice barely audible. 1 walking the perimeter every 15 minutes. The wounded one is inside with Jennings and Gideon, Sadie added, having completed her own reconnaissance. I could hear them talking through the back window. Ruby nodded, her mind working through possibilities. 3 years of running had taught them to observe, to wait, to find weaknesses that others missed. And every building had weaknesses. The chimney, Violet said suddenly. It's old brick, and some of the mortar has cracked. A small person could fit through. All eyes turned to Mercy, the smallest of them at 8 years old. The little girl straightened her shoulders with a determination that would have made their father proud. I can do it, she said simply. I've climbed worse things than chimneys. Ruby hesitated. Sending her youngest sister into a building full of armed killers violated every protective instinct she possessed. But Gideon was dying in there, and they were running out of time. The plan is simple, she said finally. Mercy goes down the chimney and unlocks the back door from inside. Clarabelle and Violet create a distraction at the front. Sadie and I go in the back, get Gideon, and all of us run for the horses they left behind the building. What if something goes wrong? Clarabelle asked. Ruby pulled their father's journal from her coat and pressed it into her sister's hands. If we don't make it out, you take this evidence to the territorial governor in Cedar Ridge. Promise me. Clarabelle's fingers closed around the leather binding. I promise. They moved with the silent efficiency of ghosts, each sister taking her position as the town around them began to stir with early morning activity. Ruby watched from the alley as Mercy disappeared into the shadows near the jail's roof, her small frame barely visible against the weathered brick. Minutes passed like hours. Then, the sound of breaking glass erupted from the front of the building as Clarabelle hurled a rock through the window, followed immediately by Violet's panicked screaming about bandits attacking the general store. The two front guards rushed toward the commotion, leaving the jail momentarily undefended. Ruby and Sadie sprinted across the muddy street, reaching the back door just as they heard the soft click of the lock being released from inside. Mercy's face appeared in the doorway, soot-streaked but triumphant. He's in the back cell, she whispered. But Ruby, you need to hear what they were saying. Ruby followed her sister through the narrow hallway, past empty cells that reeked of fear and violence. In the last cell, Gideon Nash sat slumped against the wall, his shirt soaked with blood from 2 bullet wounds. But his eyes were alert, and when he saw them, something like hope flickered across his features. The journal, he said weakly. They know about the journal, but they don't know you have copies. Copies? Ruby fumbled with the cell keys, her hands shaking. Your father was smart, Gideon explained as the lock clicked open. He made 3 copies of everything and hid them in different places. The journal you carry is just one piece of the evidence. Sadie helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as they prepared to escape. Where are the other copies? Bank vault in Cedar Ridge, Gideon said, each word an effort. And buried beneath the old oak tree behind your family's original homestead. Ruby felt her world shift. They weren't just carrying evidence. They were carrying the key to destroying the entire Meridian Group operation. But as they reached the back door, the sound of returning footsteps told them their time had run out. Colonel Jennings's voice boomed from the front of the building. Search every room. They're here. The 5 sisters and their wounded protector were trapped in a stone box with professional killers closing in from both directions, and this time, there was nowhere left to run. Well, well, Colonel Jennings said, stepping into the back hallway with his rifle trained on them. The famous Callahan sisters. You've led us quite a chase. Ruby positioned herself between the colonel and her younger sisters, her father's journal pressed tight against her chest. Behind Jennings, she could see his remaining men blocking the corridor, their weapons drawn and ready. You killed our father for trying to expose the truth, Ruby said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. How many other families have you destroyed? Jennings smiled coldly. Your father was a fool who didn't understand how business works in the territories. Sometimes progress requires making difficult decisions. Progress? Sadie stepped forward, her 12-year-old face twisted with rage. You call murder and theft progress? I call it survival, Jennings replied. The weak make way for the strong. It's the natural order of things. Gideon struggled to stand straighter, using the cell bars for support. Tell them about the other families, Jennings. Tell them about the Harrisons, the Bakers, the Montgomerys. How many innocents have you killed for their land? Enough talking, Jennings said, raising his rifle. Hand over that journal, girl, and I might let some of you live. Ruby looked at her sisters' faces, Clarabelle's determined eyes, Sadie's burning fury, Violet's quiet courage, and little Mercy's unwavering trust. 3 years of running had brought them to this moment, and she realized they weren't the helpless children Jennings believed them to be. You want the journal? Ruby said, slowly pulling it from her coat. Then take it. She hurled the leather book toward Jennings, and as he instinctively reached to catch it, Clarabelle threw the handful of sand she had collected from outside directly into the eyes of the man beside him. Chaos erupted in the narrow hallway as the sisters scattered like startled deer. Sadie dove for the wounded man's dropped pistol, while Violet grabbed a heavy iron keyring from the wall. Mercy, despite her size, managed to trip one of the guards as he stumbled blindly forward. Ruby herself launched herself at Jennings, driving her shoulder into his midsection and sending them both crashing to the floor. The colonel was stronger, but Ruby had spent 3 years learning to fight for her life. As they struggled for control of his rifle, she heard the distinctive click of a pistol being cocked. Let her go, Sadie said, her voice deadly calm as she pointed the captured weapon at Jennings's head. Now, Jennings released his grip on the rifle, his eyes calculating as he assessed this new development. Around them, his men were either disabled or disarmed, victims of a coordinated attack that had taken less than 30 seconds to execute. "You think you've won?" Jennings said, slowly raising his hands. "The Meridian Group has connections throughout the territory. Judges, sheriffs, politicians, they all answer to us. Even if you reach Cedar Ridge, no one will believe a handful of orphaned girls." "Maybe not," Ruby said, retrieving her father's journal from where it had fallen. "But they'll believe this." She opened the book and pulled out a folded document that had been hidden between its pages. Even in the dim light of the jail, the official seal was clearly visible. "A full confession," she said, "signed by Marcus Webb before you killed him. He documented every murder, every theft, every bribe, including the names of every politician who took your money." Jennings' face went pale. "That's impossible. Webb burned everything before he died." "He burned copies," Gideon said, managing a weak smile. "But not before he gave the originals to Thomas Callahan. Your former partner had a crisis of conscience, Colonel. He wanted to make things right before you silenced him forever." The sound of horses approaching outside made everyone freeze. Through the barred windows, Ruby could see riders wearing the uniforms of territorial marshals, led by a man whose badge caught the morning sunlight. "Marshal Davies," Gideon called out, relief evident in his voice. "Perfect timing." Jennings snarled, his hand moving toward a hidden knife at his belt. But before he could draw it, the front door burst open and armed lawmen flooded into the building. "Colonel Wade Jennings," Marshal Davies announced, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and violation of territorial land laws." As the marshals secured Jennings and his men, Ruby felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she had carried for 3 years. But her relief was short-lived when she noticed the marshal's grim expression. "You girls did well getting this evidence to us," Davies said, "but I'm afraid your fight isn't over yet." He pulled out a telegram, its edges torn from hard travel. "We received word this morning. The remaining members of the Meridian Group have put a bounty on your heads. Every gunfighter and bounty hunter in 3 territories will be looking for you now." Ruby stared at the telegram, realizing that capturing Jennings was only the beginning. The Meridian Group's reach extended far beyond one man, and they had just made themselves targets of an organization with resources they could barely imagine. Freedom, it seemed, would require one final desperate gamble. 6 months later, Ruby Callahan stood on the steps of the territorial courthouse in Cedar Ridge, watching as the last member of the Meridian Group was led away in chains. The trial had taken weeks, but the evidence her father had collected proved devastating. Every corrupt official, every forged deed, every murdered family, all of it documented in meticulous detail. "That's the last of them," Marshal Davies said, joining her on the courthouse steps. "With Marcus Webb's confession and your father's records, we've dismantled the entire operation. The bounty on your heads has been officially canceled." Ruby nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she had carried for nearly 4 years. Around her, the people of Cedar Ridge went about their daily business, unaware that they were witnessing the end of one of the territory's most dangerous criminal organizations. "What about the families who lost their land?" Clara Bell asked, approaching with their younger sisters. At 15 now, she had grown taller and more confident during their months in protective custody. "Full restitution," Davies replied. "The territorial government is returning all stolen property to its rightful owners, plus compensation for damages. Your father's work will restore dozens of families to their homes." Gideon Nash emerged from the courthouse, his left arm still carried in a sling, but his eyes clearer than they had been in 15 years. The bullet wounds had healed, but more importantly, so had the guilt that had driven him into isolation. "The governor wants to offer you girls a permanent home," he said. "Good families in town who would be honored to take you in." Ruby exchanged glances with her sisters. They had discussed this possibility many times during the long months of testimony and trials. Safety, stability, the chance for normal lives, everything they had dreamed of during their years of running. "We appreciate the offer," Ruby said carefully, "but we've already made our decision." She gestured toward the wagon parked outside the courthouse, loaded with supplies and building materials. "We're going home, back to our father's original homestead. That land has been abandoned for 4 years, Davies protested. "The house is probably falling down and winter's coming." "Then we'll rebuild it," Sadie said firmly, her 13-year-old voice carrying the same determination that had helped them survive. "It's where we belong." Gideon stepped forward, his decision already made. They won't be going alone. Ruby looked up at him in surprise. You don't have to. Yes, I do, Gideon interrupted. I made a promise to your father 15 years ago, and I broke it. I've spent too many years running from my responsibilities. If you'll have me, I'd like to help you rebuild. Not as a protector or a guardian, but as family. Mercy, now 9 and no longer the frightened child who had climbed down a chimney to save them all, tugged at Gideon's good hand. Will you teach me to track like father did? If you want to learn, Gideon said, smiling down at her. Your father was the best tracker I ever knew. Violet and Clarabelle began loading the last of their belongings into the wagon, while Sadie checked the horses. Ruby watched her sisters work together with practiced efficiency. No longer the desperate fugitives they had been, but a family preparing for a new beginning. You sure about this? Marshal Davies asked. You could have comfortable lives here in town. Ruby looked back at the courthouse where justice had finally been served, then toward the mountains where their father was buried, and their new life waited. Comfortable isn't what we need, she said. We need to be home. As their wagon rolled out of Cedar Ridge, Ruby held her father's journal in her lap, its pages now part of the permanent court record that had brought down the Meridian Group. Behind them, the town grew smaller until it disappeared entirely. Ahead of them lay the valley where Thomas Callahan had raised his daughters to be strong, brave, and uncompromising in their pursuit of justice. Gideon Nash no longer lived alone in a cabin built from guilt and fear. The 5 Callahan sisters no longer ran from shadows and hired guns. Together, they were going home to build something new from the ashes of what they had lost. The hunted had become the hunters, the fugitives had become the victors, and the broken family had become whole again. In the end, that was all the justice they needed. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.